A man's hand slid a manila folder across the reception desk of Callaway Interiors. The folder had a tab. The receptionist read the tab and then looked up at the man on the other side of the desk with the expression of someone who has just read a name and is verifying that the name matches the person in front of her.
It did!
On the top floor of the Callaway Interiors building, Vivian sat at the head of a large desk with the green notebook open in front of her. The company logo was on the wall behind her, the logo Harold had designed in 1991 with the particular confidence of a man who believed in what he was building, and Vivian sat beneath it with the quality of someone who had been in this room many times and was entirely at home in it. She was not a visitor. She was the owner. 3 years ago, at a dinner table in front of his wife and his children and the good dishes Vivian had set out, because she had wanted the evening to be right, her son had told her that she had never contributed anything real to this family. He had laughed when he said it, not cruelly, which would have been easier to understand, with the easy confidence of a man who considers himself accurate. His wife had not stopped him. No one had. Genevieve stepped into the office with the quiet knock of someone who has learned to announce herself without interrupting the quality of the room, and she crossed to the desk and placed a folder on its surface with the care of someone delivering something they understand to be significant. She said, "Mrs. Callaway, we received an application today. I thought you should see it before it went to the review panel." Vivian looked at the folder. She opened it. She read the name at the top of the first page, the name that was also her name. The name she had carried for 41 years, the name of the company on the wall behind her, and the man who had built it, and the son who had laughed at a dinner table 3 years ago and did not know what he had built his laughter on. She closed the folder. She looked out the window for a long moment. The city below the Callaway Interiors building moved in the way of cities in the middle of a workday without awareness of the specific gravity of what was happening in the office above it. Vivian said, "Schedule him for Thursday, Genevieve. Standard process." She paused. She said, "Don't tell him who the final interview is with." Vivian set the table at 6:15, which was when she always set it on Fridays before Dorothy arrived, and before the evening had fully settled into itself. 2 placemats, the good ones with the blue border positioned at the 2 sides of the kitchen table, rather than across from each other, because Vivian had always believed that the best conversations happened when the people having them were not facing each other directly, but were angled slightly toward the same direction, as if they were both looking at something together, rather than at each other. 2 glasses, 2 sets of silverware, the bread plate for the bread that Dorothy would bring, because Dorothy always brought bread, or something warm in a covered dish, which was Dorothy's way of contributing to the Friday evenings without making the contribution into an announcement. And at the head of the table, the 3rd chair. It was slightly larger than the other 2, the Carver chair that had been Harold's chair for 31 years, and it was set with its own placemat and its own glass, empty and polished, and its own silverware, arranged with the same precision as the others. Vivian ran one finger along the back of it before she went to the kitchen to finish preparing the way she touched it every Friday, briefly and without ceremony. Dorothy arrived at 6:30 with a covered dish that smelled of something with rosemary and garlic, which she carried with the particular care of someone transporting something warm that they don't want to spill. And she kissed Vivian's cheek and took her usual seat, and they began the way they always began, with the small things. Dorothy's week had involved a disagreement with the woman at the dry cleaners and the resolution of the disagreement, which had been satisfactory. Vivian's week had involved the garden, which was coming along, and a book she had started on Tuesday that she was not sure about yet, but was giving more time. The weather was cooling. Dorothy's youngest grandchild had said something at breakfast on Wednesday that Dorothy had written down because she wanted to remember it exactly. Vivian listened with the full attention she gave to everything Dorothy said, which was the attention of someone who finds other people's lives genuinely interesting, rather than an obligation to be managed. This was not shyness on Vivian's part, and it was not performance. It was precision. She had always been more interested in the details of other people's experience than in presenting her own, which was one of the things Harold had said distinguished her from everyone else he had ever met. Dorothy glanced at the empty chair. She did this every Friday, the brief, involuntary glance of someone who has been looking at the same thing for 3 years and has never quite stopped being curious about it. Usually she let the glance pass and returned to her food. Tonight she set her fork down. She said, "Vivian, the chair, 3 years. Will you tell me?" Vivian refilled Dorothy's glass with the unhurried motion of a woman who is deciding in the time the refilling takes exactly how much to say. She said, "It's the seat of the person who decides things. I'm practicing." Dorothy stared at her. She said, "Practicing for what?" Vivian said, "For when it matters." Dorothy looked at the chair, and then at Vivian, and then at the chair again, and she was quiet for a moment with the particular quality of someone who has received an answer and is not sure whether it has explained anything or made everything more mysterious. On the sideboard behind Vivian, the green notebook sat in its usual position. It had been there every Friday for 3 years in the corner of the sideboard between the fruit bowl and the small ceramic dish where Vivian kept her reading glasses. Dorothy had seen it every Friday and had never seen it open. She looked at it now. Vivian said, "Dorothy, tell me about the grandchildren." And Dorothy, who was in fact dying to tell her about the grandchildren, told her. The evening moved through its course in the way of Friday evenings that have been established over 3 years and have found their rhythm the food and the wine and the conversation that moved from practical to personal, and back again in the natural way of 2 women who have known each other long enough to navigate each other's silences. Vivian's phone sat face down on the counter. It did not ring from Dominic's number. It had not rung from Dominic's number since the dinner 3 years ago, which Vivian had mentioned to Dorothy once in passing 2 years ago, and had not mentioned since because mentioning it once was sufficient, and mentioning it more would have been something else. After dinner, Dorothy dried while Vivian washed, and they worked in the comfortable parallel of women who have done this enough times together that the logistics no longer required discussion. The kitchen held the smell of the rosemary dish and the wine and the particular warmth of a room that has been used for a meal and is settling back into itself. Dorothy hung her dish towel and gathered her things and kissed Vivian's cheek at the door. Vivian turned off the kitchen light. She stood for a moment in the doorway between the kitchen and the dining area, where the table was still set, the 3 placemats and the 3 glasses and the silverware, catching what light came in from the hallway, the chair at the head of the table, in the particular shadow of a thing that is present and waiting. She said, "Not yet." She said it quietly to no one in the room, or perhaps to Harold, or perhaps to the chair itself, which had been set every Friday for 3 years, and would be set again next Friday, and the Friday after that, until the moment arrived when it no longer needed to be. 3 years of Friday dinners. 3 years of the empty chair. Dorothy had stopped asking most weeks, but Vivian had never once forgotten to set it. Vivian was at the kitchen table with the green notebook open when the drop of water fell from the glass she had been drinking and landed on the page, blurring one line of the careful handwriting she had maintained for 28 years. She blotted it immediately with the corner of a cloth, pressing gently, the way you press a thing that has been damaged and you are trying to preserve what remains without making the damage worse. The line was recoverable. The ink had spread slightly at one word, but the word was still legible if you knew what it was, and Vivian knew what it was. She held the cloth against the page for a moment, and the kitchen was quiet, and the flashback came the way it always came when she was with the notebook. Not as something she summoned, but as something that arrived when the conditions were right, which was the way she had come to understand most things about the past 3 years. 3 years ago! Dominic's house on the north side of the city was the kind of house that announced its own success in every direction. The high ceilings and the new kitchen and the art on the walls that had been chosen by someone with taste and significant resources which Renata had, and which she deployed with the assured confidence of a woman who understood that her choices were always the right choices. Vivian had brought flowers, peonies because it was the right season, and because she had always believed that bringing flowers to a dinner was not a formality, but a statement about the kind of evening you hoped to have. Renata had thanked her with the warmth of someone who had learned warmth as a social practice and was deploying it correctly. The flowers went into a vase that Renata selected from a cabinet with the swift efficiency of someone who had many vases and knew which one was appropriate for peonies. The dinner was good. The table was well set. Dominic was in the form he was in when he was proud of something, which was the form of a man who has achieved things and would like the people around him to be aware of the achieving. He talked about Meridian Design Group, his company, the expansion they were undertaking, the new contracts, the staff they were adding, the direction the market was moving, and how Meridian was positioned within that movement. He talked with the fluency of someone who had told this story many times and had refined it to its most effective form. Renata's brother, a pleasant man named James, who asked questions because he was genuinely curious rather than because he was performing curiosity, turned to Vivian at some point during the second course and asked whether she had been involved in Harold's company. It was a polite question, the kind that included her in the conversation, the kind that assumed she might have something to contribute to it. Dominic answered before she could. He said Mom numbered Dad built that. Mom was home. He said it the way he said things that were obvious without particular emphasis, the way you state something that does not require defense, because it simply is. Vivian said I wrote the strategy for the Kellerman account. Everyone at the table looked at her. She said, and the Brixton portfolio, and the foundational pricing model for commercial contracts that is still the basis of the company's billing structure. She said it in the tone she used for facts, which was a plain tone, neither insistent nor apologetic, the tone of someone noting something that is true and that the record should reflect. Dominic laughed. It was not a cruel laugh. Cruelty would have been easier to locate and easier to answer. It was a careless laugh, the laugh of a man who finds something gently, warmly incorrect and wants to set the record straight without making anyone uncomfortable. He said, Mom, you help Dad proofread things. That's not the same as strategy. He picked up his wine glass and held it with the ease of a man who is comfortable in the room he is sitting in. He said you were great at dinners like this one. The house, the table, the way everything felt right when you walked in. He raised his glass toward her. That was your contribution. He meant it as a compliment. Vivian looked at the raised glass. Then his elbow moved a small shift in his position as he turned back to James to continue the conversation, and the glass tipped. The wine went across the tablecloth in the slow red spread of a liquid that has found a level surface and is taking its time, and a significant portion of it went onto Vivian's sleeve, the cream wool sleeve of the cardigan she had worn, because she had thought the evening called for something nice. Dominic said, Oh God, Mom, I'm so sorry, looking at the spreading stain with the concern of a man who had done something and was sorry for the something he had done, which was spill the wine. Vivian took her napkin and blotted her sleeve. She said, It's fine, Dominic. She said it the way she said most things, with the tone that closed a subject rather than opened it, and the conversation moved on to other things, because conversations moved where they were allowed to move, and she had given it permission. She finished her dinner. On the drive home, the city lights moved past the car windows, and Vivian sat in the passenger seat because she no longer drove at night with her bag on her lap. She reached into the bag. The green notebook was there where she had put it that morning, where it had been all evening. She had brought it with the intention of showing Dominic one page. Just one. The Kellerman strategy, the original notes, the handwriting that anyone who had ever seen Harold's handwriting would immediately recognize was not Harold's handwriting. She held the notebook in both hands in the dark car. Then she put it back in the bag. She closed the bag. She looked out the window at the lights. She had 30 years of strategy in that notebook. She had brought it to show him one page. She drove home with it unopened. And she never offered to show it again. The home office was the smallest room in the house and the most used. One window facing east, which meant it had the morning light when Vivian worked in the mornings, which was always. One desk clear except for the green notebook and the pen she kept beside it and the cup of tea she brought with her each day. One shelf on the wall above the desk holding two things, the green notebook when it was not in her hands, and the frame photograph of Harold from 1988, the year Callaway Interiors had its first significant contract. Harold in his good shirt looking at the camera with the expression of a man who has just been told something he already knew. Vivian sat down and opened the notebook. The pages were dense with the accumulation of 28 years of working the handwriting, small and consistent, the margins used for secondary thoughts and revisions, the diagrams that appeared when words were insufficient, arrows and brackets, and the particular shorthand she had developed over the years that was legible only to her, which had been fine because she had always been the only one who needed to read it quickly. She turned to 1994. The Kellerman strategy was there in the precise form. She had written it 17 pages of analysis and proposal and implementation sequence, the blueprint for what became Callaway Interiors' expansion into commercial contract work and the foundation of the company's most profitable decade. She traced one line with her finger, the line about the pricing structure, the line that had survived 28 years of application and revision, and was still the structural basis of the company's commercial billing. She remembered Harold reading it at the kitchen table. He had sat with it for 40 minutes, which was how long Harold took with things he was serious about, and when he finished he had looked up and said, "This is the one." He had said, "This is how we scale." Vivian had been at the counter making tea. She said, "You scale. I'll keep writing." Harold said, "That's not how this works, Vivian." He said it the way he said things he disagreed with directly and without the pretense that the disagreement was negotiable when it was not. Vivian said, "Yes, it is." She turned and looked at him across the kitchen. She said, "You're better in rooms than I am. You walk in and people want to follow you. I watch you do it and I don't know how you do it." She said, "I'm better on paper. I see the structure and I write it down." She said, "We are two halves of a thing that works. Why would we rearrange it?" Harold had looked at her for a long moment. Then he had looked back at the notebook. He had said, "You should have your name on this company, Vivian." She said, "I have something better." She came to the table and sat across from him and put her hand on the open notebook. She said, "I have the notebook. The company is yours. The mind behind it is mine." He had looked at her with the expression she had spent 31 years learning the full meaning of, which was the expression of a man who loved her in the specific way that included complete respect for the way she understood her own life. He had said one day, "I'm going to find a way to make this right." She had said, "It's already right, Harold." He had gone back to reading. The partnership had the quality of a thing that had been designed by two people who understood each other well enough to build something that fit both of them exactly, which was the rarest kind of design. Harold in the rooms, in the presentations, in the handshakes, and the client dinners, and the conference tables where Callaway Interiors was represented. Vivian at the desk in the mornings in the green notebook where the strategy lived before it became the company. She wrote the map. He drove. It was not a lesser role. It was the role she had chosen with full knowledge of what she was choosing, the choice of a woman who understood her own strengths and had no patience for performing in areas where her strengths did not lie. In 2018, Harold's health had begun its final decline, the slow process of a man who had been strong for a long time and was encountering his limits. He had called Mr. Ishida in October of that year on an afternoon when Vivian was in the garden, and Vivian had seen through the kitchen window that Harold had his serious face on the face he used for things that required precision. Mr. Ishida had asked if Vivian should be present. Harold had said not for this one. Mr. Ishida had said Harold. Harold had said she'd argue. He said she'd say it's unnecessary, and then she'd be gracious about it, and then she'd go to bed worried, and I don't want that. He said, "I know what I'm doing. I've always known what I'm doing when it comes to Vivian." At some point in that final year, Harold had come to the home office while Vivian was elsewhere in the house. She knew this because she had found the notebook slightly differently positioned than she had left it, the way a book sits differently after someone else has held it. She had opened it and turned to the last written page, which was the most recent entry she had made, and below it in Harold's handwriting rather than hers, a single line. "She built this with me. She'll know what to do with it when the time comes. She always does." He had signed it with the H he used for informal correspondence. He had closed the notebook and put it back on the shelf. Present. Vivian closed the notebook. She picked up the frame photograph. Harold in 1988 in his good shirt looking at the camera with complete confidence. She said, "You made me wait 4 years, you know." She set the photograph back on the shelf but turned it a fraction of a degree toward the door, the small adjustment of a woman who finds comfort in the direction of things. Then her phone rang, Genevieve's name on the screen. Genevieve, who was the director of HR at Callaway Interiors, and who had never called Vivian on a Monday morning before, and Vivian answered with the quality of attention she brought to things she had been expecting. She listened. Her expression did not change. It had the steadiness of a woman receiving confirmation of something she has known was coming, which was different from surprise and different from triumph, and was closer to the particular stillness of someone who has set a table and heard footsteps at the door. She said, "Schedule him for Thursday, Genevieve. Standard process." She said, "Don't tell him who the final interview is with." Harold had written the condition into his will the year before he died. He was not a vindictive man. He was a precise man who understood his son and understood his wife, and had seen from the position of someone who loved both of them and could not fix what was between them exactly which door Dominic would eventually knock on. He had made sure Vivian would be the one to open it. Dominic arrived at 9:55. He had the quality of a man who had prepared for a specific challenge and was confident in the preparation, the settled forward energy of someone who has done the research and knows the material and is ready to demonstrate that he knows it. He had spent 2 evenings on Callaway Interiors, the company history, and the portfolio, and the market positioning and the recent projects, and he had found what he expected to find, which was a well-run mid-sized design firm with a strong legacy and a reputation that had held steady since his father built it, and he had prepared his interview materials accordingly. He had not researched the ownership structure. He had not thought to. The offices were on the 4th floor of a building in the design district, and they had the particular quality of a space that had been designed by people who took design seriously and considered their own offices part of the work they were presenting to the world. The light was good, the kind of considered lighting that was not decorative but functional in the best sense, making the work on the walls visible at the right angle. The reception desk was clean, and the waiting area had the kind of furniture that had been chosen rather than purchased. Genevieve met him at reception. She was 34 years old, and she had the composed professional warmth of someone who was very good at her job and had developed the ability to make everyone who entered the building feel that they had arrived in the right place. She shook Dominic's hand and said his name and told him they were glad he could come in, and she led him down the hall to the conference room and gestured to the chair and asked if he needed water and brought it before he answered. She gave nothing away. Dominic opened his portfolio on the conference table and reviewed his notes while he waited, and the first panel arrived at 10 o'clock precisely too, senior designers and a project manager who asked the questions that interview panels asked, which were the questions designed to establish competence and compatibility and the quality of a person's thinking under mild and structured pressure. Dominic was good at this. He had been in rooms like this one many times on both sides of the table, and he had the particular fluency of a man who was genuinely qualified and who also understood how to present qualification, which were 2 different skills that did not always appear together. He spoke about project management with the specificity of someone who had actually managed projects. He spoke about client relationships with the particular candor of a man who had learned things the hard way and was not embarrassed to say so. The panel responded to him. The audience watching could feel the complexity of it, the way Dominic, in a professional context, was not the man at the dinner table or was that man, but was also more than that man, and the competence was real, and the confidence was earned in at least the professional dimensions of his life. Between the first and second panels, he was left in the hallway with a cup of coffee. He stood at the wall of frame pieces that ran along the corridor the company history presented in the way of companies that understood their own story and wanted visitors to understand it too. The founding year, the first significant project, the progression of the portfolio from residential to commercial, the awards and the recognitions, the photographs from 30 years of Callaway Interiors being a company in the world. Dominic stopped at the founding narrative panel. It was a large piece, well-designed, the text set and the clean typography the company used for everything, and it told the story of Harold Callaway and the founding of the firm in 1991 and the principles that had guided it since. Harold's name was prominent as it should have been the name of a man who had built something that deserved to be built and whose legacy was on every page of the portfolio in the waiting room. Dominic looked at his father's name with the particular expression of a man encountering a version of his own history that is presented formally the pride of a son at a father's achievement, private and genuine. He looked at it for a moment. Then his eyes moved to the next panel. He did not read the bottom corner of the founding narrative, the section below Harold's biography, where the firm's acknowledgments were printed in the slightly smaller type of supporting information. He did not read the line that had been there since the panel was commissioned, the line that Vivian had not asked for and had not known about until after Harold died, when she came to the office for the first time in her capacity as owner and walked this corridor and saw it. With the strategic partnership of V. Calloway, without whom the foundational work of this firm would not have been possible. He walked past it. Genevieve appeared at the end of the corridor. She said, "Mr. Calloway, one more interview, the final one." She led him down the corridor. He had just walked past the panels he had looked at and past the one he had not read, and she stopped at a door near the end of the hall, and she held it open with the professional neutrality of someone who is very good at revealing nothing. Dominic straightened his jacket. He stepped inside. The office was the corner office, the one with the window that looked out over the street and the light that came in at the angle that made the desk and everything on it visible and clear. Behind the desk, the company nameplate centered on the surface, and the green notebook open to a working page, and the window behind her, and the company logo on the wall was Vivian. She was wearing her good cardigan, the gray one, and her silver hair was up in the way she wore it when she was working, and she was looking at him with the expression she had been carrying for 3 years. Of Friday evenings and green notebook mornings, the expression of a woman who has been waiting for a specific moment and has arrived at it and is entirely ready for what it contains. Dominic stopped walking. The portfolio folder was still in his hand. He looked at his mother. He looked at the nameplate. He looked at the green notebook on the desk, the green notebook he had seen on the sideboard every Friday evening for 3 years, and had not asked about the green notebook that had been in his mother's bag at the dinner table 3 years ago, and that he had not known was there. He said, "Mom, what are you?" Vivian said, "It's Mrs. Calloway in this room, Dominic." She said it the way she said most things, with the plainness of a fact that did not require elaboration. She said for the next hour, "After that, you can call me whatever you like." She gestured to the chair across the desk. She said, "Sit down, Dominic. We have a lot to talk about." She had not raised her voice. She had not smiled. She was simply completely in the chair at the head of the table. He had prepared for every question they could ask him. He had not prepared for the one person in the world who already knew every answer. Vivian gestured to the chair. Dominic sat slowly, the portfolio folder still in his hands, the folder he had prepared with the careful attention of a man who understood that presentation mattered and had organized his materials accordingly. It had felt adequate this morning when he reviewed it at his kitchen table. It felt different now, not inadequate exactly, but suddenly beside the point, a document prepared for a room that turned out to be a different room from the one he had anticipated. The green notebook was open on the desk between them. Vivian said, "I'm going to conduct this interview as I would any other, and then we'll talk." She said it the way she said things that were not proposals, but statements of how the next period of time would be organized. She said, "Can you do that?" Dominic said yes. He said it quietly, which was not how he usually said things in professional contexts, and the quietness told Vivian something about where he was, which was somewhere he had not planned to be. She asked the first question. The questions Vivian asked were not the questions of the junior panel, the standard competence-establishing questions that interview panels use to set a baseline. They were the questions of someone who had spent 28 years assessing what strategies worked and why, questions designed to reveal how a person thought rather than what they knew. The questions that required a respondent to reason in real time rather than retrieve prepared answers. Dominic answered them well. Vivian had known he would be genuinely good at the work he did. He had built Meridian Design Group from a 2-person office into a firm of 30 before the market had shifted and the financing had failed, and the skills that had built it were real skills developed over a career of doing actual work rather than performing the appearance of doing it. She listened to his answers with the full attention she gave to everything, and she did not allow her expression to tell him how she was receiving what he said, which was one of the things she had always been able to do, that Harold had admired the capacity to listen without the listening being visible on her face. She said, "What do you know about the founding strategy of Callaway Interiors?" Dominic looked at her. He said, "My father identified a gap in the mid-range commercial market in the early 90s before the category became as competitive as it is now. He understood that clients in that range wanted design quality that had previously been available only to larger corporate clients, and that the right firm positioned correctly could own that space." He talked about Harold's instinct for the market and Harold's taste and Harold's understanding of what clients needed before clients understood it themselves. He was thorough. He was accurate about his father in the specific way of someone who has thought about a person a great deal and has organized their thinking into a coherent account. He did not mention Vivian once. She let the answer finish. Then she reached across the desk and turned the green notebook so it faced Dominic. She said, "Open it to page 43. He set down the portfolio folder and picked up the notebook. It was heavier than he had expected, the weight of 3 decades of paper filled with careful handwriting, and he held it with the slight adjustment of someone recalibrating for unexpected mass. He opened it to page 43. The Kellerman Strategy, dated April 1994. 17 pages of analysis and proposal and implementation sequence, the handwriting dense and consistent, the margins full of secondary thoughts and revisions. The kind of document that showed a mind working through a problem rather than presenting a solution that had already been arrived at elsewhere. He turned the page and read the continuation, the pricing structure and the client segmentation and the competitive positioning, the logic of it, moving from the opening analysis through to the specific recommendations in the sequence of someone who understood how to build an argument from evidence. His face was doing something that Vivian watched without commenting on. He said, "This is Dad's handwriting." Vivian said, "No, it's mine." He looked at her. She said, "Turn to page 12. He turned back the earlier pages, page 12, and found the Brixton Portfolio Strategy dated 1997, the same handwriting, the same density of thought, the same methodical movement from premise to conclusion. He read it. She said, "Page 71. He turned forward. The Commercial Contract Framework 2003, the document that had become the basis of the company's billing structure for all commercial work, and that was still in use. Vivian knew because she had reviewed the company's current contracts when she took her seat and had found her own framework operating exactly as she had written it 20 years before. Dominic read page 71. His face was changing in the way faces change when information is arriving that requires the rearrangement of something more fundamental than knowledge, when a story a person has been telling themselves is being revised not from the outside, but from within, the particular look of a foundation shifting. Vivian said the appendix. He turned to the back of the notebook, the appendix section, and he found there the accumulated evidence of 28 years of strategic work, the entries organized by project and by year, the full record of what had been thought and written and implemented under the name of Callaway Interiors, all of it in Vivian's handwriting, all of it dating from years before Dominic had been old enough to understand what strategy meant. He turned the pages slowly. He turned them the way a person turns pages when they are not looking for something specific, but have understood that everything they encounter on each page has weight and deserves the time it takes to receive it. He reached the last section of the appendix. The entry was on the final written page below the last strategy entry Vivian had made before Harold died, and it was in different handwriting. Harold's handwriting, the particular upright letters she had read on birthday cards and notes, and the margins of newspaper articles for 31 years. "She built this with me. She'll know what to do with it when the time comes. She always does." The date was 2 months before Harold died. He had signed it with the H he used for informal correspondence. Dominic read it. He read it again. He was very still in the chair. Vivian waited. He closed the notebook. He placed it back on the desk in front of her with the care of someone handling something they have just understood is irreplaceable, setting it down with the particular gentleness of a person who has realized too late the nature of what they are touching. "He said I didn't know." Vivian said, "I know you didn't." The office was quiet. The city moved below the window with its ordinary Wednesday indifference. The nameplate was centered on the desk, and the green notebook was between them and the chair Dominic was sitting in was the chair that had been on the other side of the desk from this one for as long as Vivian had been working at this desk. Dominic said, "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Vivian said, "I tried." She said it without heed as a fact in the record. She said at a dinner table 3 years ago. You laughed. Dominic looked at the closed notebook on the desk. He did not have an answer for this. He had spent 3 years building the account of his professional life on the story of a self-made father and an invisible mother. Every page of the notebook was a chapter of a different story, the one she had been writing for 30 years, in the room, at the back of the house, in the chair. No one had thought to look at in the handwriting that was not Harold's handwriting, and had never needed to be mistaken for it. The story had been there the entire time. He simply had not read it. The notebook was closed on the desk between them. Dominic's portfolio folder was on the chair beside him where he had set it 20 minutes ago. When he stopped holding it, the careful preparation of a Thursday morning interview, sitting beside him with the particular irrelevance of something that had been made for a different room than the one he turned out to be in. Vivian stood. She went to the small credenza by the window, the credenza that held a carafe of water and 2 glasses, and the small things that a well-run office kept available for the long conversations, and she poured 2 glasses and carried them back to the desk and set one in front of Dominic and sat down. The water caught the window light. Dominic looked at the glass in front of him. He said the dinner, the wine. He said it the way you say things when you are naming them for the first time with the correct weight. Not as a question and not as a prepared statement, but as the arrival at something you have been circling for 3 years and have finally reached the center of. Vivian said you spilled the wine, and you apologized for the spill. She said it without sharpness as a description of what had happened organized into its accurate components. She said you were not wrong about the spills. Dominic said I said you didn't contribute anything real. Vivian said yes, in front of 6 people. He said I believed it when I said it. He paused. He said, "That's worse, isn't it?" Vivian said, "Yes, it is." The office held this for a moment in the way of a room that has received something true and is making space for it. Dominic looked at the glass of water. He picked it up and set it down without drinking from it, the action of a man who needed something to do with his hands while his mind was working through something that did not have a quick resolution. He said, "Meridian." Vivian said, "Tell me." He told her. He told her the way a man tells a story when he has decided to tell it honestly, rather than strategically without the management of the impression he was making, which was something Vivian had not heard from him before, and which she listened to with the complete attention she gave to everything that deserved it. The overextension into the commercial market before the infrastructure was in place to support it. The partners who had seemed aligned and had not been aligned in the ways that mattered. The market reading that had been optimistic in the specific way that market readings are optimistic when the person making them wants a particular outcome and has allowed the wanting to influence the analysis. He told it accurately. As he talked, Vivian listened and heard underneath the account he was giving the structure of what had gone wrong, which was the structure of decisions made from instinct, rather than from the methodology she had spent 28 years developing the decisions that skipped the careful foundation work in favor of the move that felt right in the room. The decisions that Harold had always been most prone to and that she had always been there to check, not by stopping him, but by showing him the analysis that preceded the feeling. Dominic had not had the analysis. He had not known the analysis existed. He had built Meridian on instinct and intelligence which were real and which had taken him further than most, and he had not had the notebook. Vivian said, "What did you need when Meridian was failing?" He said someone who knew the numbers better than I did. He said someone who could see the structure and tell me where the load was going to be before it arrived. He said someone who could tell me which decisions were recoverable and which weren't. Vivian said yes. She said it the way she said things that confirmed what she already knew quietly and without making the confirmation into a larger point than it needed to be. Dominic said Renata supported every decision I made, every one of them. Vivian looked at him. She said that is not always the kindest thing a person can do. He looked at her. She said support and agreement are not the same thing. A person can support you and still tell you when you're wrong. Support without disagreement is not support. It is company. She said it without any reference to the dinner table, without naming the pattern she was describing in any personal terms, and Dominic understood that she was not criticizing Renata, who was not in this room, and whose character was not the subject of this conversation. She was naming something structural, a dynamic that had been present in his professional life, as well as his personal one, the way of being surrounded by agreement that feels like support, until the moment when what you needed was not agreement, but the person who could see what you couldn't. He understood her. He was quiet for a moment. Then Vivian said, "I'm going to offer you the position." She said it with the tone she used for decisions, which was the tone that contained the decision fully rather than presenting it for reaction. She said, "Not because you're my son." She said, "Because you are qualified. Your experience in client development and project management is relevant and genuine, and the panel this morning agreed with that assessment independently of anything I said to them." She looked at him directly. "And because I think the next stage of your career will be better if you can see clearly what built the ground you're standing on." Dominic looked at her. He said, "I don't know how to work for you." Vivian said, "You'll learn." She said, "You're good at learning when you let yourself." She said it the way she had always said things she knew were true about him, without the inflation of a compliment or the deflation of a criticism, as an accurate observation from someone who had been watching him for 44 years and knew the difference between what he was capable of and what he had been doing with what he was capable of. The glass of water was still in front of him untouched. She had poured it and carried it and set it in front of him herself across a desk in the office of a company she owned 3 years after wine had spilled across her sleeve at a dinner table, and no one had said anything about the words, only the wine. She offered him the position, not as a gift and not as a punishment, as a decision made by the owner of a company that had been built in part to outlast exactly this moment by a woman who had spent 28 years building things that were meant to hold, and who had not stopped building simply because someone had laughed at a dinner table. Dominic came home at 6:30. Renata was in the kitchen when he came in, and she looked at his face with the attention of a woman who had been married to a man for 17 years and had learned to read the specific qualities of his silences, and what she read in this one was something she had not seen before, which was the silence of a man who had been inside something that had changed the shape of things, and had not yet finished understanding how. She said, "Sit down. I'll make tea." He sat at the table. It was the same table, the same kitchen, the same table where 3 years ago the dinner had been the good dishes, and the wine, and the polished surface that had held the glasses, and the moment when one of them tipped, and the wine had gone across the tablecloth and onto his mother's sleeve. The table had been cleared many times since then, and had held many other meals, and was now quiet and ordinary in the way of things that have been the site of significant events and have continued to be used for ordinary purposes. He told her what had happened. He told it in order from the reception desk to the junior panel to the corridor and the founding narrative panel and the door that Genevieve had opened, and then the office and the green notebook and what was inside it and Harold's entry in the back of it, and then the conversation and Vivian's offer at the end. Renata listened. She did not interrupt, which was itself something Dominic noticed, the quality of her listening, the way she held the account he was giving without inserting her own responses into the spaces between sentences. When he finished, there was a silence that had weight to it, the silence of two people sitting with something that had been placed between them on a table. Renata said, "I should have said something at the dinner." She said it the way you say something when you have been thinking it for a long time and have finally arrived at the place where saying it aloud is the correct action, not as an apology with all the performance that apology sometimes required, just as the naming of the thing she had not done and should have done. Dominic said, "You didn't know either." Renata said, "I didn't know about the notebook." She said, "I knew what you said wasn't kind." The kitchen was quiet. Dominic picked up his tea and held it. Renata said, "She offered you the job." He said, "Yes." She said, "What is there to think about?" He said, "Whether I can do it, whether I can walk in there every day," and he stopped. Renata said, "And face what you said." Dominic said, and face what I didn't know. He set the cup down. He said, "Those are different kinds of hard." Renata looked at him across the table. She said, "What was she like?" "In the office." Dominic thought about this for a moment, the real thinking of someone trying to be accurate rather than the reflexive answer that came first. He said exactly like herself. He said it with the slight wonder of someone who has encountered something unexpected and is naming the unexpectedness. He said, "That's what I couldn't get over. She was exactly who she's always been. She made tea the same way she makes tea at home. She listened the same way." He said, "I just never looked at the context around her. I never looked at what she was in the room she was actually in." Renata looked at her hands on the table. She said, "Neither did I." She said, "That's something we can fix." She picked up her phone. Dominic watched her. She found the number she had not called in 3 years, the number that had Vivian's name beside it, and that Renata had looked at occasionally in the way of a contact you have not erased, because erasing it would be a different kind of statement than simply not calling. She dialed. Dominic watched his wife make the call he had not asked her to make, the call she had decided to make, before the outcome of anything was determined, before Dominic had given his answer, and before the situation had resolved into whatever it was going to resolve, into which meant the call was not strategic, and was not performed for an audience, and was simply what Renata had decided was the right thing to do. In the evening of the day, she had learned what she had learned. Renata said, "Vivian, it's Renata." She said, "I wanted to call before the decision was made. I owe you that, at least." There was a pause on the other end of the line, the pause of a woman who was receiving something she had not been expecting and was deciding how to receive it. And then Vivian's voice came through the phone, quiet and unhurried, the voice Dominic had been hearing his entire life and had only today understood the full dimensions of. She said, "Thank you, Renata. That matters." The call was short. Renata set the phone on the table. She and Dominic sat in the kitchen at the same table as 3 years ago, and the room had the quality of a place that has held something difficult for a long time and is beginning slowly and without announcement to hold something different. The next morning, Dominic called Genevieve at 8:45. He said, "Please tell Mrs. Calloway I accept the position." He paused. He said, "And please tell her I'll be on time." He had other options. The options were fewer than they had been a year ago, but they existed, other firms, other conversations, other paths through the next chapter of his professional life that did not require him to walk into the building on the 4th floor of the design district every morning and sit across from his mother's desk. He accepted it anyway, because for the first time in 3 years, the most honest room he had been in was the one his mother was sitting at the head of. And honesty, he was learning, was worth the particular difficulty it cost. Friday evening, Vivian set the table. 2 placemats, the good ones with the blue border. 2 glasses, 2 sets of silverware placed with the precision she brought to every table she had ever set, which was the precision of someone who understood that how you arranged the surface of a meal said something about how you intended the meal to be. And at the head of the table, the large chair. She pulled it in. Not the slight positioning of a chair, being set for an absent presence the way she had set it for 3 years, with the particular placement of something being kept ready for when it was needed. She pulled it in the way you pull in a chair you are going to sit in, close to the table, angled forward, the way a chair sits when a person has arrived at it and intends to stay. Dorothy came at 6:30 with a covered dish and let herself in the way she had let herself in for 3 years of Fridays, and stepped into the kitchen and stopped. She looked at the table. She looked at the chair at the head of it, pulled in, no longer waiting. She looked at Vivian. She was quiet for a moment, which was not Dorothy's usual quality, and the silence had in it everything Dorothy felt about 3 years of Friday evenings, and the empty chair, and the question she had asked, and the answer she had been given, and the fact that she was standing in Vivian's kitchen on a Friday evening, and the chair was pulled in, and Vivian was standing at the counter looking at her with the expression she wore when she had done something she had been working toward for a long time. Dorothy said, "Well, it's about time." Vivian laughed. It was a real laugh, the laugh of a woman who has been waiting for someone to say the exact right thing and has just received it. And Dorothy laughed too, and the kitchen held the sound of it. the way kitchens hold laughter when the people laughing have known each other long enough for the laughter to be entirely unperformed. They sat down at the table, Vivian at the head, Dorothy at her usual place, the candles lit because Vivian had lit them tonight, which she did not always do. Over dinner, Vivian told her everything. She told it in the order it had happened, from the Monday morning phone call from Genevieve to the green notebook open on the desk to Harold's final entry in his own handwriting to the glass of water she had poured and carried across the desk and set in front of her son. She told it plainly and completely, and Dorothy listened in the way she listened to things that deserved the full attention she was capable of, which was considerable, without inserting her own responses into the spaces between sentences, without the small affirmations that usually punctuated her listening. When Vivian finished, Dorothy was quiet for a moment. Then she said Harold set this whole thing up. Vivian said he always did see further ahead than anyone. Dorothy said, except you. Vivian considered this. She said we saw the same distance, in different directions. She picked up her glass. He saw forward. I saw through. We needed both. Dorothy said, what will it be like, having Dominic at the office? Vivian said, strange. She said, and then less strange. And then, eventually, I think, useful. She held the glass and looked at the candle. She said he's his father's son. When he finally looked at what was in the notebook, he understood it immediately, the structure of it, the way the pieces connected. He didn't need it explained. He just needed to see it. She said, that's not nothing. Dorothy said, are you going to be all right working with him? Vivian said, I raised him, Dorothy. I know exactly how he thinks. She paused. That used to be a disadvantage. Now it's just a resource. Dorothy looked at her across the table. She said Harold would be very pleased with himself right now. Vivian said Harold was always very pleased with himself. She said it with the warmth of someone describing a quality in a person they loved completely, the warmth that existed on the other side of loss when enough time had passed, and the person's most characteristic qualities had become the things you missed most specifically. She said, but yes, he would be. After dinner, they moved to the sitting room, and Dorothy talked about her week, the grandchild, and the dry cleaner, and the book she had finished on Wednesday that had surprised her at the end. And Vivian listened with the complete attention she always gave to Dorothy's weeks, because Dorothy's weeks were genuinely interesting, and because listening was one of the things Vivian was best at, and best at in the specific way of someone who considered it a practice rather than a courtesy. When Dorothy went to get her coat, she passed the sideboard. She stopped. The green notebook was there, as it had always been worn at the corners, the cover soft with 28 years of handling, and beside it, touching it at one edge, a second notebook, smaller than the green one, new. The cover uncreased, the spine unbroken. The pages inside still blank and white and waiting. Dorothy said, what's the new one for? Vivian said the next 30 years. She said it with the small smile of someone who has thought about a thing and arrived at the correct answer and is pleased with the arrival. She said someone has to write the strategy. It might as well be me. Dorothy looked at her. She put on her coat. She kissed Vivian's cheek at the door and went out into the Friday evening, and Vivian watched her go down the front path and close the door and stood in the hallway for a moment in the quiet of the house after company has left, which was a particular quiet, familiar and comfortable, the quiet of a space returning to itself. She went back to the kitchen. She cleared the table, the 2 placemats and the 2 glasses and the silverware, the candles. She blew out the cloth she folded over the rail by the sink. She moved through the clearing with the deliberate attention she gave to endings and beginnings, understanding that the way you finished one thing affected how you started the next. She picked up the new notebook from the sideboard. She sat down at the head of the table, not to practice, not to rehearse the sitting or to remind herself what the sitting felt like, or to hold the chair in readiness for the moment when she was finally ready. She sat down because it was her chair, and it was her table, and it was Friday evening, and the dishes were done, and the week had been what it had been, and the next week was coming, and she had work to do. She opened the new notebook to the first page. She held the pen. The page was blank, white and clean and entirely without history, which was the quality of a beginning that has been chosen rather than stumbled into the particular blankness of a page that belongs to a person who knows exactly what they are about to write and is simply allowing herself the moment before the first word. She had spent 30 years writing the map and letting someone else hold it up. She had spent 3 years practicing to sit at the head of the table. On a Friday evening, with the dinner finished and her friend gone home and the new notebook in her hand, she simply sat down. There was no ceremony. There was no announcement. There was just a woman in the right chair at the right time, exactly where Harold had always known she would end up. Some people wait for permission. Vivian Calloway was done waiting.